All right. Hello and welcome to the House Progressive Caucus. It's Tuesday, March 18th. We'll start today with announcements, and then we'll do introductions, especially for our guests from
Transportation for Vermonters.
Transportation for Vermonters Coalition. This is not going to get screwed up a second time. Thank you so much for being here. And then Representative Chloe Tomlinson will be facilitating the conversation about public transit. So announcements, happy second week of crossover. We'll have the same floor schedule this week. We're not expected to go late, but we'll know in advance if we're going to. Thursday, there will be a joint assembly at 10:30 a.m. to appoint 7 judges. So we need to be on time, and because there are 7, it's going to take a while. Today, we postponed H222 due to illness over the weekend of the bill reporter. If there are going to be any other changes to the schedule, Jill will let us know before we get started, and I'll let you know. 2 bills have received a crossover exemption. First, the education bill that the House is working on with the Senate, and then H91, the emergency shelter bill, has received an additional week for testimony before we're requiring it to be passed out of committee. There are several bills going to Ways and Means and several bills going to appropriations. I'm happy to give the list to you if you're interested in knowing. There are 2 grassroots actions scheduled this week at the State House, both today on housing and Thursday. Agatha, our Sergeant at Arms, has been receiving hate mail over the last week over purported unequal treatment of protesting groups last week. She did treat the 2 groups equally. However, protesters for one group surrounded her, and one of the protesters tried to grab Agatha's name tag off of her, and now she's receiving ongoing email, what I would call harassment. So let's keep this in mind and make sure that Sergeant at Arms and legislative leadership are receiving updates about any grassroots actions going on in the State House this week. Thursday, Outright Vermont will be here, which I'm sure will just be a joy. So, all right, those are announcements. We'll go ahead and start with introductions. Everybody in the room always introduces themselves. I can go first. I'm Rep. Kate Logan. I use she or they pronouns. I represent the Chittenden 16 district, which is central Old North End and downtown Burlington. And I serve on the Committee on Environment.
Hello, I'm Will Anderson. I'm also from Burlington. I work with state governments, and I'm also a commissioner for Burlington for Green Mountain Transit.
Brian Chena, I don't know who ours.
Courtney Record, State Assistant Clerk.
Brian Chena, State Representative Chittenden 15, Burlington.
John Hronsky, I'm in Burlington. I'm the Progressive Party Director and the staff support for the caucus.
Rob Kidd, the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club Conservation Program Manager, and live here in Mount Clear, and I work on mostly transportation and climate issues.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Stoddard-Poor. I'm with AARP Vermont. I'm the Associate State Director there, and I live here in Montpelier, and our offices are downtown Burlington.
Hi, I'm Katie Gallagher, use she, her pronouns. I live in Waterbury, work for the Vermont Natural Resources Council, and as part of that role, also coordinate the Transportation for Vermonters Coalition.
I'm Rep. Chloe Tomlinson. I represent Winooski and serve on the House Committee on Transportation.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Seidner. I work for the Vermont Natural Resources Council, and I help support the Transportation for Vermonters Coalition, and I live in Burlington.
I'm Mark Language. I'm a emeritus professor of economics, and I work with the Sierra Club. Malice Bay.
Well, welcome everyone, and particularly thank you to those from the Transportation for Vermonters Coalition who are joining us here today. And from what I understand, delivering a petition of nearly 1,000 Vermonters who are urging us to make the necessary investments in public transit. So it's a very timely conversation to be together here in the caucus meeting to understand more about sort of where the current state of public transit in Vermont and sort of what our the value of it and also what our hopes are to accomplish in this biennium and beyond. First, we kind of wanted to just lay a bit of groundwork of there's been conversation in the news around the cuts that are happening for Green Mountain Transit, but just to sort of get a sense of what is the current status of our public transit system in Vermont and how did we get here. And so I'll kind of share some guiding questions and then folks can jump in. Are you better with Katie?
Sure. So I guess maybe to take a step back for a second, because I think it's important to think about public transit in terms of like the broader transportation network system that we have, and that a healthy transportation system includes multiple modes and options for people to get around. Some work better for others, some work better in different areas of our state than others. So public transit is a really important piece of that overall network system. The overall network, with a particular focus on public transit, has been facing funding challenges for many years now. This has been flagged as something that has been coming, will continue to come. This is not a Vermont specific issue, but as we have changes like declining gas tax revenues as our vehicles become more efficient, which is a great thing, but it just means that we're getting less money that way. We have increasing costs related to ongoing maintenance as we have more climate impacts. There's all these kind of forces that are coming together. Then we got hit with COVID in particular. That was a big issue for public transit because you lost ridership. Transit in particular is really depends on both folks who are dependent on public transit and folks who choose to take public transit to round out that system and make it viable. And when we lose those choice riders, it's really hard to get them back, oftentimes because it's kind of more of a like cultural or behavioral thing. So we have gotten back a significant amount of those riders, but more on for those who are dependent on transit, not so much on the commuters who are choosing to ride and have other options. So our public transit system in the state is facing both the challenge of kind of a financial crisis, and that's, as Representative Tomlinson noted, GMT is already facing cuts, but our rural transit providers are also not that far behind, and we need our kind of choice riders, cultural encouragement, I think, to get people to understand the importance of public transit as well. So there's the kind of like technical financial piece of it, and we need to have a broader societal conversation about the importance of transit.
Absolutely. Great job. I would just like to add beyond, the fixed route system that we have for public transit, there's also on-demand service, which is really important for older adults. So the older adults and disabled, and it used to be called the elderly and disabled program, but now it's older adults and those who have a disability program, which we get federal funding for, that provides what is sometimes referred to as paratransit, but that is that on-demand service. And that's really critical for getting older adults and people living with a disability to and from medical appointments. So those routes can only deviate 3/4 of a mile from a fixed route. So as you can imagine, it can really leave out a lot of Vermonters who are in very rural parts of the state. So many of our transit providers have these very robust volunteer programs as well. So volunteer drivers who are going out and picking up people to get them to medical appointments. So these are just other sort of safety nets that are kind of built into our transportation network, as Katie had shared, which is much bigger than just transit, right? We want to be thinking about all modes, but we need to make sure that we're thinking about this in a thoughtful way. And one of the most complex things, and this is something that Katie, Rob, Evelyn, and I talk about often, is that many of us don't actually know how the funding pie works for when we look at our public transit, right? So, and many Vermonters, when they think about the bus that goes through their community, they might not even know how it's funded. And so I think getting a better handle on how public transit is funded is a really important next step. So that is one thing that ARP is going to be working on, is providing some funding fact sheets, so that we understand what really makes up our public transit. And when we look at the bigger picture of our transportation budget, what is the sliver that is really being dedicated to public transit?
Okay, and it's me. So as I stated, is I primarily come at this from a climate perspective, but actually I appreciate working with the Transportation for Vermonters Coalition, because Kelly frequently reminds us it's more about accessibility. So there's a lot of people who can access a personal vehicle or can't even access transit. So like we have one member who's always reminding me, I had to pay him to come down here today from Albert because there is no public transit. So there is no way for him to get here. So I just want to remind you of that. But as a note, I just wrote a couple notes here just to kind of frame this around the cost of it. With public transit, in last year's budget was $55.5 million for a public transit program. This year's is $52.7 million, so it's dropped. Now, Green Mountain Transit budget did slightly increase by $500K, which is real pennies because they're facing serious shortfalls. And the other transit providers are facing that as well. But it's also to kind of look is Representative Logan and your former representative from your district, Kirk McCormick, pushed to have a study on increasing transit ridership in Vermont. And basically, it's one of those typical reports that were taken and thrown on a shelf because we really don't have the money to do it. But that report had a whole line of strategies on how we can advance transit, between fare-free transit to increasing technology, using alternative ideas. There's just like all these different things that basically that report is on a shelf in House Transportation Committee. You probably haven't even looked at it. They probably have not came out, even though I suggested it in one of my testimony, but they revisited. But that's kind of the situation on that. Now, I also want to do is right now, ridership is about 5.1 million people have ridden on a bus this year. No, wait, that was pre-pandemic. Now it's 4.6 total ridership. So we've actually dropped. We haven't recovered from COVID, but now what's happening? The transit routes are forced to cut because they're not getting the ridership. Well, maybe because we're not following the report suggesting all these things increase. We're not putting our money where our mouth is with these transit programs. So we have to kind of figure out that. Now, like I know in Representative Thomason, your district, a lot of your members your constituents are facing cuts. I know Lenore Dodge and Essex facing a lot of cuts. So, but meanwhile, last year you all passed an Act 250 reform bill that required more transit, more development around transit. So here we have one policy that's encouraging transit, but meanwhile we're cutting the routes. So which is it? Now, I want to give one more statistic just for your considerations here. The average cost of owning and operating an automobile in Vermont is $11,000. So if anybody's not talking about transportation, about equity, you're not really talking about equity, because that's a major burden on a lot of Vermonters because they need it to get to their works, they need it to get to their jobs. Oh, same thing. The medical appointments, school, provide for the families, all that. So just $11,000. So how are we going to get there? How are we going to get people off of personalized vehicles? So that's my short story.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And actually, that's a really good transition to the next question as you're talking about the Act 250 reforms and smart growth. We've been talking in this caucus and, as a body in our various committees, a lot about our housing crisis, our healthcare crisis. So I was hoping, you could speak a little bit to how public transit intersects with housing and healthcare or any other.
I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Build on that. Sounds good.
We also have a guest.
I hope you don't mind.
Yeah.
I'm currently reading a book by Ken Snyder. I don't know if you know him, an Ukrainian expert, but also he's talking about freedom. And I really think that's something involved here. You know, people have the ability to have the freedom to get to a job, to get to their medical appointments, the freedom to go to a park that's not nearby. It's freedom for a lot of individuals. So that may appeal to a different type of legislator as well. But I think it's really important for some people, for them to actualize or just become the people that they want to be. They need that access.
Absolutely. Just to build off that a little bit, you know, that is something that's very important from ARP's perspective is when, you know, often cars represent this sort of independence or freedom for individuals. So if they can no longer drive, or they have to hang up the keys to their car, or if they can't afford to drive, right? There's many reasons what push people to hanging up the keys to their car. They want to reduce the impact on the environment. They have a disability, but that independence is really scary to be lost, and the isolation that can come from not getting out of your house has a significant toll on your health. Social isolation is equivalent to smoking 14 cigarettes a day. We all know what that does to our health, but social isolation has a tremendous health impact. And I think it's really important that we understand why it's so important that there's opportunity for people to get outside of their home and to be engaged in their community, whether they're still working, or they have to get to appointments, or they need just social connection with other adults. So just thank you for raising that point.
My background is as a community planner and in community development, so I'm going to try not to go off on this for too long, but I think it's a really important question as we talk about specifically in the housing conversation, just because it is so critical right now, and we're doing a lot of really great work to encourage more housing, but where that housing is located is so important so that we don't lose the affordability benefits that come with additional housing by then increasing our transportation costs if we're putting it out, you know, kind of in a greenfield or in a more sprawling location. Also, so that we're not then increasing our greenhouse gas emissions by requiring people to drive more, and so that we're then not decreasing the vibrancy and the livability of our downtown centers, which really help to contribute to all of these different pieces related to independence and being able to access our schools and our places of employment, et cetera. So I think that transportation has been a hugely missing component of the conversation around housing and development. And it seems like it's kind of creeping back in, which is really, really great to see. I also wanted to mention, this is something that we hear a lot from particularly our rural transit provider partners, is that when we're having conversations around schools and healthcare, particularly around consolidation, those cost savings related to consolidation don't just go away. People still need to get there. So to the extent that we're then shifting costs onto transportation, we need to be aware that that is happening, and that's still a need, and that people don't always have a personal vehicle to just go wherever they want, at whatever point in time that they want.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we learn year after year from surveys that we put out in the field that are, whether they're national surveys or they're Vermont specific surveys, is that how as we age, we're going to get around is a top concern. We do a Vital Voices survey in Vermont, and from 3 years ago, it increased to over 7%. Of people's concern about how am I going to get around in my community as I get older. And so when we think about where our housing is located and services and amenities, we want to be able to really focus them in our downtowns and our village centers where people can access them easily. ARP has been very supportive of zoning reform so that we can see more missing middle housing types in and around our downtowns that make it easier for older adults to be able to downsize into. And making sure that we've got different modes of transportation. Walkability is also a huge priority for us because it is the preferred mode. After people drive, people want to walk places. It's great for our health. And it can get us to where we need to go. So all of those types of investments need to be really thoughtfully and strategically done. So.
Okay, I have another statistic. I don't normally talk statistics, but I have one. 80% of Vermonters live within 4 miles of what they categorize as a transit center. Now, it's what is operational, whether it's a train or a bus, but 80% live within that short 4 miles of distance.
Mm-hmm.
So what we need to do is not just do those particular routes as fixed routes, but find innovative ways to get people connected. So like, I know, like, this is one of the things, I bike a lot, but not every Vermonter can bike everywhere. I bike here all winter long. But like, advancements of e-bikes, making sure that roads are accessible to all pedestrians or bicyclists or those in a wheelchair so they can access it. And then we expand on programs like the microtransit they do here in Montpelier, not just partially fund it and say, oh, well, it didn't work because it's not fully funded or not fully adequately invested in. So that's why we have to look for these innovative solutions, particularly like programs like the Mobility Transportation Innovation Grants that Senator Tamash was actually created. So I reference the progressives. It was basically a way to spawn innovation in these programs. But every year the Agency of Transportation comes in and say, oh, we don't need that program, or we only need it for 100,000, 500,000, or just $1 million. We have to have real investments, not just pennies on the dollar. And that's going to be my other stat is, I think right now the 6% of the state budget, the transportation budget is spent on transit, while meanwhile he's spending over $100 million a year on paving roads. So it's like we had to flip the switch on where we're getting money for transit and how much is being spent.
Yeah, transit budget is nearly $500 million. 50 million are going to public transit. Yeah. Then I guess that's a good moment to talk a little bit about public transit priorities this biennium. I know there's a petition that's been delivered and would love to hear more, from each of you about what you see as the priorities that we should be focusing on this biennium.
So I think the kind of big picture priority that the Transportation for Vermonters Coalition has narrowed in on has been the fact that we kind of come up with our priorities every year, and we're a diverse coalition, so there's a lot of them, and then every year it's like, but funding is a challenge. So we're always coming back to funding. Transit in particular has, as we noted, been particularly hit by that. And so where we came to this year was the fact that the legislature has asked for and received multiple studies over the past couple of years, and probably I know some consultants have worked on many very similar studies for a long time related to funding options for both transportation more generally and for public transit specifically. And those have produced several different recommendations of here are the pros and cons of different options. Our understanding is that those get presented to the Senate and House Transportation Committees, and then as Rob said, they end up sitting on a shelf. And part of that, we understand the transportation committees have so much going on. And so the deep dive into those policy, really tough policy questions, just there isn't kind of space for those. So what the petition is really asking for is for the legislature to prioritize those conversations and say, okay, we have these potential recommendations. We really need to recognize the urgency of this situation and take the time to do that deep dive into what those studies are recommending as potential options, and then bring it forward. That there isn't, we haven't come as a coalition to say there's one solution that we would like to see. It's more, we need to have these policy conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I second that. One thing that I think is really important, and whether it gets tackled this biennium or the following, is the amenities that go along with transit that make it comfortable, appealing, and accessible. And it's something that we hear over and over from our members, is that, you know, there's no bus stop. There's sometimes not even a sidewalk that leads to the bus stop. There's no shelter from snow or rain. There's no lighting. These are things that provide all of us dignity when we're riding the bus. And it makes it really difficult to encourage people to want to ride the bus when it's not very inviting and or accessible. So I think that is something that I would love to see, you know, gain some more interest and to work on. So and I think, you know, there's something we try to tackle in very small ways by partnering with transit providers to get some more shelters built through, you know, more of a public-private partnership. And but I think that there's just such opportunity to work with employers, transit providers, and public, you know, government dollars to be able to get better amenities out there to support ridership.
So while we're on to the funding, one of the reports that Katie's referenced is the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission did a report where they hired Stedman Associates to do all the different funding mechanisms to look at transit. And you go through the report and it's classic. It says, yes, this would raise us this much, but then there's a check mark. Is it politically feasible? And this is the real biggest challenge, is every one of these funding sources come up not really being politically feasible because it's not being addressed. During this governor's administration, we talked about funding crisis and funding shortfalls in transportation and going downward spiral. And the only solution that this governor has proposed is taxing EVs. Now, it's something we do need to increase, and we do need to figure out how to pay for our roads. But of all the major problems in the transportation budget, that's the only solution this governor has done. And then the legislature, because it's not really a top priority, we need to kind of address how we're going to pay for these particular funding. Or are we going to take it from the maintenance budget? Or are we going to take it from paving budgets? Are we going to take it from the state airports? Or like, you know, that's those decisions that need to be made. We know this is a priority issue, but how are we going to get there? You know, and the federal government, the Congress, there's been repeatedly over the years a bill to propose 50% of transportation funding goes to transit. Maybe in some of the cities we could do that, but maybe in Vermont we just need 10% going to transit. So some type of mechanism for us to have all the resources. So what Kelly said, like covered bus parking, bus stops, like heated bus stations, like the latest technology. Those things need money, and we're not going to get there, and we're going to leave people behind if we're not addressing that, forcing them to be stuck in the personalized automobile.
I want to take a moment to open up for any questions or comments.
Yeah, I've been creating a list. I may not ask you everything on it, depending how long the answers are, but. So let's see, let's start with this one. Can you kind of give us a little bit of a projection of what the impact of any cuts to federal funding as part of impoundment and other policies that we're seeing rolling out might have on our transportation budget in Vermont? For example, like for healthcare, 62% of the amount we spend on Medicaid comes from the federal government. Like for transportation, what's, do you know the percentage? Any words on that? And then I have another question about money, but I'll pause.
Yeah, I don't know the percentage out of Medicaid budget that goes into transportation, but it would certainly impact it greatly.
And you know, I appreciate what you just said, because I wasn't even talking specifically about Medicaid, but you made a point, which is Medicaid is funding transportation. So if that gets cut, it's going to impact. But there's also lots of other money that, like infrastructure money. So do any of you have a clue of the?
Oh, thank you. You guys should see that. Well, I didn't know
Can you
that.
say who you are for the?
I'm
Leon Red Dodge rep from, Ethics. I just remember from my days on transportation last session that about, 80 to 90% of each bus is federally is paid with federal funds. The real challenge is our staffing. You know, and the reality is that, you know, GMT had to, cost of living, they had to match the reality of a tight labor pool, and challenging conditions increasingly, you know, as a bus driver, and, you know, made a negotiation with the drivers unions that to try to keep routes served. But we won't have buses if, you know, they last about 6 years, whether you buy a small one or a large one. And so we are in a lot of trouble if we lose all of that funding.
If there's no other
And we get like $600,000 up to 6 times, depending on, so just the urban transit gets, as long as they meet 6 different milestones or kind of mileposts, 6 achievements, they get about 600,000. It used to be at least about 600,000 federal dollars in kind of recognition of different successes. So ridership, if you're starting a new route, if you're working efficiently. And GMT for years has outmatched, you know, has been in the tops like 80 to 90% of urban transit agencies in the country, you know, comparative size, similarly sized agencies, and has outperformed, you know, a lot of the nation, and has achieved like 4 of the 6, they're called stick factors.
If there's no other on the money, can I ask another question about that's more policy?
Yeah, we have 5 more minutes just for.
Well, does any other person have a question first? And if not, I'll ask it. Seeing none, so I'm going to combine some questions. So, one of the challenges of being a rural state is how do you get people, they say that last 4 miles or whatever the phrase is. I'm not the transportation person here, obviously, but I'm aware of the problem. I'm curious if I looked and I couldn't find that report that was referred to on the shelf easily. There's like many transportation reports. If someone could tell us the name of it, and then you don't have to give a comprehensive summary, but maybe just a few examples of innovations that might be used. For example, could the state buy a fleet of AI cars, not Tesla, and you know, deploy them on some Uber-like app 24/7? You know what I mean? Are people thinking like that much out of the box? Could there be horses and buggies that pick us up, like dolphins that swim up the river? Oh, damn. Any ideas?
So the first is I'll forward to you all after the report.
Thank you.
That has the innovation that's called the report to increase transit ridership in a rural state, 2019.
Oh, it's that old.
Yeah, so it's right before the pandemic.
I didn't go back that far. That's good.
So I'll send you that link. But there's like a lot of the different amenities, like, you know, what Kelly just said about like making covered bus stops, having a technology, using smaller vans, and like, you know, instead of these big buses that we're using, having amenities on the bus, like, you know, all those different ideas and components, working with more employers to do transportation demand management, to get larger employers to contribute more money. All those little things add up to it. Changing the marketing. Like I remember, I'm like in that. I actually, Representative Kurt McCormick demanded I sat on that study, and it's like one of the rarities. So I get lobbied by the legislature to actually be on that. And I sat there, and one of the things that happened was the imaging people have of the bus. There's always this image that people have of the bus being, oh, there's something wrong with you. You're taking the bus. Instead, let's make it, flip it on the end, make it attractive. Millennials, I know, are interested in like what we're doing something good. Instead of like, all the derogatory norms about these smaller buses, we got to make the technology more attractive to people. So that was one of the ideas that was in there in that report. And they've tried to do it through some of these smaller programs like the Mobility Transportation Innovation Grants, but it's underfunded. It's barely even looked at. It's kind of brushed, oh, we can do that, or oh, your grant's only $50,000. You name me a program you can do with $50,000. You can't. I mean, I can't even afford my salary. Like I get a grant for Sierra Club for $50,000 and it's gone tomorrow. So how are we going to operate a transit authority or a transit program with that much smaller money? So I will send you those reports.
We've got to wrap it in 2 minutes.
What's that?
We have to wrap it in 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah. I would just echo the attractiveness. I took Representative Kurt McCormick's seat, after he stepped down, due to, his illness. And so I decided I would try to follow in his footsteps and take public transit to the State House from Burlington every day, which I mostly did for my first year. And I will say the bus is uncomfortable. It's, the heat, it's either too hot or it's too cold. The Wi-Fi doesn't work all the time. There's nowhere to put a laptop so I can use the 90 minutes of my commute to my full advantage. There's nowhere to put down a coffee cup, all these things that I would want if I was going to be a regular rider. If it were more comfortable, more attractive. I grew up in Chicago, so I'm used to public transit. I think it's great. I would love to never drive. It'd be awesome. I found the second best option in having an EV, but still have to drive it. Anyway, I would love for us to have a vision as a caucus, as a party, about like, even though we recognize the political reality of the moment, what do we want to accomplish in the long term? What can we do in the short term? What can we be demanding in the short term for our communities? I also have to say my father lives in downtown Burlington in a Burlington Housing Authority over 55 community on College Ave. He can jump on the College Ave bus right outside his door. He can walk to the public transit center and easily get anywhere. It keeps him active. He has lost like 15 pounds since he moved to College Ave just because he's so busy, and he's 2 blocks off of Church Street. He can walk to the grocery store. Like, it's great. It's perfect. So I love your vision, and I know that we would like to do anything that we can to support it and make it one of the primary things that we're advocating for our communities this week, especially as we focus on housing and development stuff.
A great note to end on. Yeah, pulling that together from Logan. And thank you to our guests for being here today. All of our guests. And I think with that we can